Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the votes that the Tories are definitely losing at the next election. They think their haul of votes was bad this time. Yeah, it stands to be much worse. And it makes no difference what they do or which direction they move in. These votes, which they won earlier this month, are definitely lost to them at the next election in 2028 or 2029. And it means the party will move backwards unless it can compensate for them elsewhere. So I hate talking about this specific aspect of the electoral landscape. I'd rather not. But the Conservatives have made it a major factor. And it is that, according to estimates published by the Times yesterday, 1 in every 6 of the people who voted Conservative in this month's election will be dead for the next election. Bit morbid, sorry. Now, this assumes the next election will be in 2029. Normal political wisdom is you hold the election a year earlier just so that nothing goes wrong in the last year if the government think they're going to win. But because we don't know that, people have to work on the basis of a 5-year parliament, which is what the expectation is constitutionally, even though that rarely happens. The Times article further reports that had that happened in this election, so had that sixth of voters gone, it would have meant Labour gaining an extra 29 seats and the Conservatives losing an additional 34. So Labour would have had the biggest haul of seats ever, and the Conservatives would have been beaten down into double figures. Not quite into third place, but much closer. And this has been caused not because the Conservatives appeal mostly to older voters. We know that has traditionally worked for them. They are the most committed voters, the easiest group to attract to Conservative policies, given that Conservative policies, although they screw everyone over, unless you're a billionaire, they most obviously screw younger people and workers over. It's much less obvious how they screw retired people over. And it's always going to be the case that a party that is especially successful at attracting the elderly vote is of course going to lose more voters than other parties between elections. This is not a problem if even voters, if they, as voters move into middle age and beyond, become more conservative and more likely to vote as they do so. And this has generally been the trend for a long time. People struggle when they're young, but some get onto the housing ladder by the time they're in their 40s and 50s. Their mortgage is close to being paid off. And even beforehand, it's much lower than rent payments for housing. Their income is likely to be higher if they've managed to pursue a decently paid career. So now they've got this quite impressive disposable income, and the only thing to complain about in their life is taxes. Enter the Conservatives who claim, oh, this thing, yeah, we can deal with that. We can do that, and we can do it without harming all of the things you take for granted that the taxes actually pay for. Only the most recent Conservative government didn't do that. They promised the lower taxes. Actually, they delivered quite high taxes, but they promised lower taxes, but they didn't even pretend to preserve the public services that people in this country, even most Conservative voters, prize above a relatively meaningless tax cut. Like, what good is a few £100s off your tax bill if it's swallowed up by higher energy bills or higher train fares or private medical bills because it takes too long to get your illness investigated on the NHS sometimes? We're still waiting for the full official analysis of the election results, but what appears to have happened was a complete collapse of support for the Conservatives amongst most age groups. And I mean a collapse. Not like there's been a reduction in all age groups, including the elderly age group, of course, but an absolute collapse. The collapse does not look quite as bad as polls suggested before the election, but that'll be down to the very low turnout. The turnout could well be higher at the next election due to various factors, especially if Labour really are seen to over-deliver and people, they've had several years seeing a rapid decline in living standards, so rapid that they noticed. There's been a decline in living standards ever since 2010. Well, actually, really since 2008. But it became very noticeable in the last few years. If they see a dramatic increase in standards ahead of the next election, then there's very few who will want to vote for a return to the bad old days. What has happened is that middle-aged voters are not turning Conservative as once they did, and so those dying elderly voters are not being replenished. Due to a combination of utter stupidity on housing policy and allowing real terms incomes to fall, so they've kept more people having to rent and also crushed their incomes as well. The Conservatives strangled off their supply of new voters. The collapse in support amongst working age groups should come as no surprise to them. Indeed, it hasn't. They've known for some time, they've been open for some time about what the problem was. They absolutely identified the problem. They just didn't do anything about it. They got trapped in a cycle of fear. Oh, if we build more houses, we grow our future support because we rely on homeowners. But we piss off current NIMBY voters now. And we need the NIMBY voters for the next election. But those who benefit from new housing won't come over to us for another decade at least. So they killed off their own future because they were too focused on short-term gains. And the Tories now have to contend with the fact that due to these policies, but also a completely out-of-step attitude on climate emergency, Brexit, culture wars to an extent, and fueling the sort of rhetoric which actually raised the profile of Reform UK, the Conservatives now face a massive problem at the next election, no matter what they do. Beyond Top Line calculated that to compensate for the expected loss of voters to death, the Tories would need to win either 7% of Labour voters back or 32% of Reform UK voters. Both of them seem challenging. I mean, those 7% of Labour voters, who might be the most likely to reconsider the Tories again in the future, will have voted Labour for their promised programme. If Labour deliver it, and indeed over-deliver it, why would they vote Conservative at the next election? So this is difficult because Labour have the power to let those voters feel that their purchase, even if it was a lent vote, was worth it. But trying to get 32% of Reform voters back is also incredibly difficult, even though that's currently what they're prioritising. Not only would that represent having to win back more voters in raw terms, because although Labour got more votes than Reform UK, it wasn't so much that 7% worth of their vote is worth 32% of a Reform vote. So they need more Reform UK votes. And that is because in most seats, in the vast majority of seats the Conservatives need to win, winning a Labour vote back is worth 2 votes because you're reducing Labour's pool and boosting your own. Whereas that is a Reform UK vote is only worth 2 to them in 4 seats in the country. So, and the other thing is the Tories can only ever be a pale imitation of Reform UK anyway. They can only ever be Reform UK light. I mean, what's the point? Reform can offer easier answers, more extreme policies. They don't have to have their figures add up because, yeah, plenty of people say, oh, your figures don't add up. They'll just say they're lying. It's the establishment lying. You know, the Conservatives can't match that. If the Tories tried to be as extreme as Reform UK, they'd just lose more of the moderate voters who threw their lot in with the party earlier this month, but had to hold their nose really hard to do so. Frankly, as far as Reform voters are concerned, the Tories could actually be better off letting Labour deal with those by clearing up the mess that led them to rise to prominence in the first place. Now, it's possible they'll do this. I see that the leadership contest to replace Sunak is going to go long after all, into November. That means the far-right loons did not get their way. So there is a chance, and it's only a chance, that the Conservatives do get a leader who tries to shift the party back towards the centre. It'll be quite difficult because a lot of their loudest voices are saying it went actually to the left wing. Rishi Sunak's a Marxist, didn't you know that? It may take a while if they try because those wanting the opposite are very deeply entrenched. You could say that Labour managed it quite quickly, but remember, the members were supportive of it after a decade in opposition and facing what we all knew would be the most destructive Tory government we've ever seen. So members in Labour were ready for it. It was like, yeah, we need to do this. Conservative Party members have only just lost after 14 years in power. They will think they can come back immediately so they don't have to compromise too much. There's also news that the Tory party conference is not going to be well attended by businesses. So fundraising potential limited. And lack of funds will mean lack of the means to pay for detailed, credible analysis of their election defeat. It means Tory MPs having to rely on what some thick herbit in the Daily Telegraph thinks caused it. You know, the same people who said Truss's mini-budget was a triumph, rather than serious data scientists and political analysts. And when the Tories were last booted out of power, they didn't really make gains at the following election. They didn't really rebuild at all. And that was at a time when their diminished stock of elderly voters was still being replenished as people approached middle-aged. They were also not tying themselves in knots over performative policies based on mindless culture wars. And they certainly did not have a populist right-wing party nicking a load of their votes. For the next election, the Tories have got all the same problems they had before, with new ones on top, and the loss of elderly voters to the passage of time without the comfort of home ownership topping up the coffers for them. That is something they can do absolutely nothing about. So any strategy the Tories do decide to adopt for the next election has to accept they're losing about a sixth of their voters from already the lowest vote share ever, and that's what they got this month. Not quite as bad if the election is in 2028, sure, but it's still a severe deficit to overcome. There are lots of good reasons to suppose the Conservatives are not likely to mount a strong challenge at the next election, that Labour will get the time needed for their decade of renewal, and this is a big one. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.